Welcome back to another episode of Infidelity Tales Lab. We're thankful for your continued viewership. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing our global reach. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, Before the Storm. Vincent Vinny Delacroix had built his life on precision. At 38, he owned 3 successful auto repair shops across Portland, employing 27 people who respected him not just as a boss, but as a man who kept his word. His hands, permanently stained with motor oil despite countless scrubbing, were steady hands that could rebuild an engine blindfolded or gently bandage his son's scraped knee with equal expertise. Growing up in the foster system had taught Vinny that family wasn't about blood. It was about choice, loyalty, and showing up when it mattered. When he met Diane Roswell at a community college night class 15 years ago, she seemed to understand that philosophy. She was studying to be a dental hygienist, working double shifts at a diner to pay her way through school. Her determination matched his own, and when she laughed at his terrible jokes about carburetors, he knew he'd found his person. Their son Trevor came 3 years later, a boy with Vinny's dark hair and Diane's infectious smile. Trevor inherited his father's mechanical curiosity, spending countless Saturday mornings in the shop, learning to identify tools and asking endless questions about how things worked. At 14, he could change oil and check brake pads better than most adults. Diane had evolved from the driven student into someone different over the years. Success had come easily after graduation. Dr. Manning's dental practice hired her immediately, and her natural charm with patients made her indispensable. But success bred entitlement. She began working late more often, joining the dental office's social circle, attending conferences that stretched into long weekends. The first crack in their foundation came when Trevor was diagnosed with leukemia at age 13. Vinny immediately reorganized his entire business, promoting his most trusted mechanic, Lou Garrett, to manager so he could spend maximum time at the hospital. He learned every detail of Trevor's treatment, befriended the nurses, and turned the sterile hospital room into a makeshift workshop where he and Trevor designed impossible cars and dreamed about cross-country road trips they'd take when Trevor got better. Diane, however, seemed to retreat. She showed up for the major appointments and the serious conversations with doctors, but she couldn't handle the day-to-day grind of illness. She'd arrive with flowers and cheerful smiles, stay for an hour, then leave for urgent work matters. Vinny understood grief manifested differently in everyone, so he carried the weight alone, sleeping in hospital chairs and advocating fiercely for his son's care. When Trevor died 8 months later, just 2 weeks shy of his 15th birthday, Vinny felt like someone had reached into his chest and torn out everything that mattered. The funeral was held on a rainy Thursday in March. Vinny delivered the eulogy, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. He talked about Trevor's curiosity, his kindness, his dreams of designing cars that would help people. He promised his son that his memory would live on in every engine Vinny repaired, every person he helped. But even in his grief, Vinny noticed things. Diane's phone buzzing constantly during the service, her frequent trips to the bathroom, the way she barely cried, while Vinny could hardly breathe through his tears. He attributed it to her way of processing loss. Everyone grieved differently, he told himself. She needed space, and he needed to honor that. The wake was held at their home, a modest 3-bedroom house that Vinny had renovated himself room by room. Friends from the shop, customers who'd become family, neighbors, and Trevor's friends filled every corner. People shared stories about Trevor, how he'd helped Mrs. Patterson next door fix her lawnmower, how he'd organized a car wash to raise money for the animal shelter, how he'd always had a smile and a bad dad joke ready. Vinny moved through the crowd, accepting condolences and making sure everyone had food and drinks. It was easier to take care of others than to sit still with his own pain. But as the evening wore on and the last guest trickled out, he realized he hadn't seen Diane for the last hour. He found her in their bedroom, not crying or processing grief, but carefully applying makeup and styling her hair. When he asked if she was okay, she barely looked at him. "I need some air," she said. "I'm going for a drive." She didn't come home that night. Chapter 2, The Unthinkable. Diane returned the next morning with coffee and bagels, acting as if staying out all night after her son's funeral was perfectly normal. When Vinny asked where she'd been, she claimed she'd driven to the coast and slept in her car, needing space to think. The explanation fell hollow, but Vinny was drowning in his own grief and desperate to believe anything that meant his wife was still the woman he'd married. The following week passed in a blur of thank you cards, insurance paperwork, and the overwhelming silence that filled the house where Trevor's laughter used to echo. Vinny threw himself into physical tasks, reorganizing Trevor's room, fixing everything that needed repair around the house, working 16-hour days at the shop. Movement kept the worst of the grief at bay. Diane, meanwhile, seemed oddly energized. She cleaned obsessively, rearranged furniture, and talked about fresh starts and new chapters. When Vinny suggested they might want to talk to a grief counselor together, she dismissed the idea, claiming work was therapy enough. 2 weeks after the funeral, on a cold Tuesday evening, Vinny came home early from the shop, exhausted and hoping to convince Diane to order takeout and maybe watch a movie together. They needed to start rebuilding their connection, finding ways to support each other through this impossible loss. Instead, he found Diane in the kitchen with a man he'd never seen before. Tall and lean, with carefully styled blonde hair and expensive clothes, the stranger was leaning against Vinny's counter, drinking Vinny's beer, while Diane giggled like a teenager. "Vinny," Diane's voice was bright but artificial. "This is Rick Chandler. He's the new dental technician at the office. I invited him for dinner." Rick extended a manicured hand and a politician's smile. "Sorry for your loss, man. Diane's told me all about your son. Real tragedy." The casual way this stranger referenced Trevor, his son, his boy, his heart, made Vinny's blood freeze. But he shook the offered hand and muttered appropriate pleasantries, confusion overriding anger. Maybe Diane had invited a work friend over to distract herself. Maybe this was her way of coping. Dinner was surreal. Rick dominated the conversation, sharing anecdotes about his previous job in Los Angeles, his plans to elevate the practice's technology, and his philosophy about living life to the fullest. He spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room, and treated Vinny with the polite condescension one might show a simple tradesman. What disturbed Vinny most was how Diane responded, laughing too loudly at Rick's jokes, touching his arm when she made points, and acting like a different person entirely. This wasn't the woman who used to fall asleep reading dental journals, or who got excited about new techniques for cleaning stubborn plaque. This was someone performing, and Vinny couldn't understand for whose benefit. After Rick left around 10 p.m., with promises to do this again soon, Vinny tried to talk to Diane about how strange the evening had felt. She accused him of being jealous and antisocial, claiming she was just trying to maintain normal relationships while he wallowed in his grief. "Maybe if you made an effort to move forward instead of treating our house like a shrine, we could start healing," she said before disappearing into the bathroom for an hour-long shower. Over the next few days, Rick's presence became a regular occurrence. He showed up for dinner Wednesday, stopped by Saturday afternoon to check on Diane, and called the house at odd hours. When Vinny answered, Rick would ask for Diane with the familiarity of an old friend, not a recent colleague. Sunday morning, Vinny woke to find Diane already dressed and applying makeup. "Rick's picking me up for brunch," she announced. "The whole office crew is going to that new place downtown." But when Vinny called the office later to speak with Diane about Trevor's memorial fund, the receptionist mentioned that Dr. Manning was at his daughter's soccer game, and most of the staff had the weekend off. When he asked about Rick Chandler, there was a long pause. "I'm sorry, we don't have anyone by that name working here." Vinny hung up the phone, his hands shaking not from grief, but from a terrible understanding beginning to dawn. Chapter 3. The Slap That Changed Everything. That Sunday night, Vinny waited in the dark living room for Diane to return from her supposed office brunch. She came home at nearly midnight, humming softly and moving with the loose contentment of someone who'd had an excellent day. "How was brunch?" Vinny asked from the shadows. Diane jumped, then laughed nervously. "God, you scared me. It was nice. We went to that place on Burnside, then walked around the waterfront. I called the office today," Vinny said quietly. "There's no Rick Chandler working there." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. In the dim light from the street lamp outside, Vinny watched his wife's face cycle through surprise, calculation, and finally defiance. "You call my work to check up on me?" Her voice rose with practiced indignation. "What's wrong with you?" "Diane, who is Rick Chandler?" She turned away, busying herself with hanging up her jacket. He was a consultant. He finished his contract this week." "Stop lying to me." The words hung in the air between them. Vinny had never spoken to her like that before. Direct, uncompromising, demanding truth. In their 15 years together, he'd always given her the benefit of the doubt, always chosen to trust rather than question. Diane turned back to face him, and for a moment, he saw something in her expression he'd never seen before, something cold and calculating. "Fine," she said. "You want the truth? Rick is someone who makes me feel alive again. Someone who doesn't want to spend every waking moment mourning the past. Our son died 3 weeks ago." "I know when my son died," she snapped. "But life goes on, Vinny. Some of us want to live it." "How long?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Does it matter? How long, Diane?" She stared at him for a long moment, then shrugged with a casualness that felt like a physical blow. 6 months. We met at a dental conference in Seattle. He was representing an equipment company. 6 months. While Trevor was fighting for his life. While Vinny was sleeping in hospital chairs and learning about white blood cell counts and chemotherapy protocols. While their son was asking why Mommy seemed so distracted during her visits. "You've been seeing him since Trevor was sick?" "Don't make this about Trevor," Diane said, her voice hardening. "This is about you and me. About how we grew apart. About how you became so obsessed with being the perfect, grieving father that you forgot you had a wife." "I forgot I had a wife." Vinny stood up, his control finally cracking. "I was trying to save our son. And what about saving our marriage?" The question hit him like a slap. How could she twist his dedication to their dying child into a failure as a husband? How could she make her betrayal his fault? "Get out," he said quietly. "What?" "I said get out. Pack a bag and leave." Diane laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "This is my house too, Vinny. Half of everything we built together. You can't just..." Just 2 weeks after my son's funeral, my wife brought her new lover to live with us, Vinny said, his voice growing stronger. When I spoke up, she acted like I was the problem. Now I'm saying get out. "Rick's not moving in," Diane said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Isn't he? Because it seems like he's been here every day this week. Drinking my beer, eating my food, sleeping in my bed when I'm not here." Her face flushed. "You don't know what you're talking about. Then prove me wrong. Choose. Him or me." The silence that followed was answer enough. Diane straightened her shoulders and looked at him with something approaching pity. "You're living in the past, Vinny. Trevor's gone, and no amount of your obsessive grief is going to bring him back. Rick helps me focus on the future." "On your future," Vinny corrected. "On your life without the inconvenience of a grieving husband. If you can't handle..." Just 2 weeks after my son's funeral, my wife brought her new lover to live with us. When I spoke up, she slapped me hard and shouted, "If you can't handle it, get out." I left with nothing, and no one cared. Those weren't his words. They were the words he'd write years later, in court documents and victim impact statements. But in that moment, watching his wife choose her affair over their marriage while their son's memorial flowers were still fresh, Vinny saw his future with perfect clarity. Diane raised her hand and slapped him hard across the face. The sound echoed through their living room like a gunshot. "If you can't handle it, get out," she shouted. Vinny felt something inside him die that had nothing to do with grief. This was different from losing Trevor. That had been a cruel act of nature, a medical tragedy that no one could control. This was betrayal, deliberate and calculated and chosen. He looked at his wife of 15 years, the mother of his dead son, and felt something new taking root where his trust used to live. Something cold and patient and absolutely unforgiving. "Okay," he said quietly, touching his stinging cheek. "I'll go." He packed a single bag and left that night. He didn't look back. Chapter 4. The Descent. Vinny moved into a studio apartment above a Vietnamese restaurant on Division Street. The place smelled like pho and motor oil from the auto shop next door, a sense that reminded him of his old life without the painful memories attached to his house. The apartment came furnished with a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and nothing else. It was perfect. He had no desire for comfort. The first month was a blur of legal consultations and sleepless nights. Diane had immediately filed for divorce and temporary spousal support, claiming Vinny had abandoned the marriage. Her lawyer, a sharp woman named Beverly Morse, painted a picture of a controlling husband who couldn't handle his wife's need for social support during their mutual grief. Vinny's court-appointed attorney, an overworked public defender named Tim Walsh, was competent but overwhelmed. During their first meeting, Walsh delivered the harsh reality. Oregon was a no-fault divorce state. Diane's affair wouldn't impact the division of assets significantly, and her request for spousal support had merit given her lower income. But she was cheating while our son was dying, Vinny protested. I understand your anger, Walsh replied, but the court focuses on financial need, not moral judgments. She makes $45,000 as a dental hygienist. You own 3 businesses worth approximately $2 million combined. The math is simple. What Walsh didn't know, what nobody knew except Lou Garrett, Vinny's most trusted employee, was that the businesses were leveraged to the breaking point. Vinny had borrowed heavily against all 3 shops to pay for Trevor's experimental treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. They'd flown to Houston for a clinical trial, to Seattle for a specialist consultation, to Mexico for an alternative therapy that cost $30,000 out of pocket. Every penny had been worth it for the chance to save his son. But now, facing the prospect of liquidating his life's work to pay Diane's spousal support while she lived with her lover, Vinny felt the full weight of his financial reality. The shops were breaking even, but barely. The debt service ate up most of the profit, and without Vinny's daily management, small problems were becoming expensive repairs. Lou was talented, but inexperienced with the business side. Customers were starting to drift away, sensing the instability. Diane, meanwhile, wasn't content to wait for the divorce settlement. 3 weeks after Vinny moved out, she showed up at his apartment with Rick in tow. They waited in the parking lot until Vinny came home from work, then approached him together. "We need to talk," Diane announced. Rick stood slightly behind her, wearing an expensive suit and the satisfied expression of a man who'd won something valuable. "No hard feelings, right, buddy? These things happen." Vinny looked at the man who was living in his house, sleeping in his bed, probably sitting in Trevor's room, sorting through the belongings of a dead boy he'd never met. "What do you want?" "I'm willing to buy out your share of the house," Rick said, pulling out a folded paper. "I've had it appraised. Market value is $420. I'll give you $210 cash today. Clean break." The house was worth closer to $500,000. Vinny had spent years renovating it himself, but it was also mortgaged for $350. Rick's offer would leave him with virtually nothing after paying off the loan. "That's generous," Diane added, not meeting Vinny's eyes. "It would solve a lot of problems for both of us." Vinny studied the paper, buying time while his mind worked. Rick's confidence suggested he had resources, real resources, the kind that didn't come from a dental technician's salary. "I'll think about it," Vinny said finally. "Don't think too long," Rick replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The offer won't stay on the table forever." After they left, Vinny sat in his sparse apartment and began to plan. Not the emotional reaction they expected, not the desperate moves of a broken man, but the methodical preparation of someone who understood that revenge was a dish best served with infinite patience. He called in favors from old customers, men who owed him money or time or loyalty. Within a week, he knew Rick Chandler's real story. Rick wasn't a dental technician. He was a professional grifter who specialized in targeting recently widowed or divorced women with assets. His real name was Robert Christopher Henley, and he had a history spanning 3 states. He'd married a widow in Phoenix and disappeared with her life insurance money. He'd convinced a divorced teacher in Sacramento to refinance her house and vanished with the proceeds. He was good at what he did, patient, charming, and utterly without conscience. Diane wasn't his first mark in Portland, just his most recent. He was living off her income while setting up his next score. The expensive clothes, the cash offer on the house, it was all part of the con. He was positioning himself to control Diane's assets, then disappear when the timing was right. The knowledge should have motivated Vinny to warn his wife, to try to save her from becoming another victim. Instead, he felt something different: opportunity. If Rick was a predator, then Diane had chosen to become prey. She destroyed their marriage for a man who was planning to destroy her. The poetic justice was almost beautiful. But Vinny's plans went deeper than simply watching his wife get conned. Rick had made one crucial mistake. He'd threatened Vinny directly, treated him like a fool to be easily disposed of. That required a response. And 8 years later, when Vinny finally stood before them in court, what he did that day would make them understand exactly how costly that mistake had been. Chapter 5: The Long Game. For 6 months, Vinny played the part of the defeated ex-husband perfectly. He agreed to the divorce terms, signed over half the house value to Diane, and took a modest settlement that left him with enough to keep one auto shop running. To everyone watching, including Diane and Rick, he appeared broken and financially ruined. In reality, he was building. The Vietnamese restaurant owner below his apartment, Mrs. Nguyen, had a son who was a computer programmer and a gambling problem. When Andy Nguyen owed the wrong people $12,000, Vinny paid the debt in exchange for certain services. Andy was talented with technology and desperate enough to avoid asking too many questions about his new employer's requests. Vinny also cultivated a relationship with Jimmy "the Fish" Torino, a small-time bookie who ran numbers out of a barbershop on the east side. Jimmy owed Vinny $3,000 for transmission work on his Cadillac, and Vinny offered to forgive the debt in exchange for information and occasional assistance with matters that required discretion. Most importantly, Vinny reconnected with Marcus Wade, his cellmate during a brief stint in county jail 15 years earlier. Marcus had been inside for burglary, Vinny for a bar fight that went too far. They'd bonded over a shared understanding that the system was rigged against men like them, and they'd stayed in touch after release. Marcus now ran a successful private security company, the kind that asked few questions about their assignments. The plan Vinny conceived was elegant in its complexity. He wouldn't simply expose Rick's con or try to save Diane from her own choices. Instead, he would orchestrate a scenario where Rick's past victims would have their justice. Diane would face consequences for her betrayal, and Vinny would emerge with everything he'd lost, plus interest. Phase 1 involved documenting Rick's activities with methodical precision. Andy Nguyen installed tracking software on Rick's phone, hacked his email accounts, and monitored his financial transactions. Jimmy Torino spread word through his network that someone was asking questions about Rick Chandler, forcing Rick to pay attention to potential threats from his past. Within 3 months, Vinny had a complete picture of Rick's operation. The man was even more dangerous than initial investigation had revealed. He wasn't just conning women. He was running identity theft schemes, credit card fraud, and small-scale money laundering. He used each Mark's home as a base of operations, then moved on when the heat got too close. Diane, meanwhile, was being systematically isolated from her friends and family. Rick convinced her that people were jealous of their happiness, that Vinny was spreading lies about him, that she needed to cut ties with anyone who didn't support their relationship. He took control of her finances gradually, convincing her to add his name to her accounts for convenience, then making investments and purchases without her knowledge. By winter, Diane had lost contact with most of her social circle and was completely dependent on Rick financially and emotionally. To outsiders, they looked like a happy couple. In reality, she was being groomed for a larger theft. Phase 2 began when Vinny made his first move against Rick's operation. Using information from Andy's surveillance, he anonymously tipped the FBI to Rick's credit card fraud schemes. Not enough to get him arrested immediately, but enough to put him under investigation. Simultaneously, Marcus Wade began reaching out to Rick's previous victims through the private investigator network. Instead of simply gathering information, they offered these women something unprecedented: a chance for justice and restitution. Vinny was building a coalition of her own, funded by the money he'd secretly saved by living in poverty while maintaining the appearance of a struggling ex-husband. Every woman Rick had destroyed would have the opportunity to confront him together, with resources and legal support they'd never had individually. But the centerpiece of Vinny's plan was more personal. Through Andy's monitoring, he discovered that Rick was planning to marry Diane in Las Vegas during the spring. After the wedding, he would convince her to take out a massive home equity loan against the house that was half Vinny's under the divorce settlement. Then he would disappear with the money, leaving Diane bankrupt and Vinny legally responsible for half the debt. It was a brilliant scam, and it would have worked against a normal ex-husband. But Vinny wasn't normal anymore. Trevor's death had burned away everything soft and trusting in him. Diane's betrayal had taught him that loyalty was a weakness others would exploit. He'd become something new, patient, calculating, and utterly without mercy for those who'd chosen to be his enemies. The wedding was set for April 15th. Vinny had 6 months to complete his preparations. On a snowy evening in January, exactly 1 year after Trevor's death, Vinny sat in his sparse apartment and wrote a letter to his son. He told Trevor about the plan, about the justice that was coming, about how sometimes being a good man meant doing terrible things to terrible people. He sealed the letter in an envelope and placed it in his safe deposit box, along with documentation of every crime Rick had committed and every step of Vinny's investigation. If something happened to him, Marcus Wade had instructions to deliver everything to the FBI and the media. But Vinny didn't intend for anything to happen to him. He intended to be very much alive to watch Rick and Diane face the consequences of their choices. 8 years later, when he finally stood before them in court, they would learn what those consequences were. Chapter 6: The Perfect Storm. As Rick and Diane's Vegas wedding approached, Vinny's network moved into position like pieces on a chessboard. Everything had to happen simultaneously to prevent Rick from escaping or destroying evidence. The wedding was scheduled for Saturday, April 15th. On Wednesday the 12th, Vinny received confirmation that all elements were ready. Rick's previous victims, 7 women from 4 states, had been secretly organized into a coordinated legal assault. Each had filed civil suits in their respective jurisdictions, all scheduled to be served simultaneously on Monday morning. The FBI had built an airtight case for federal fraud charges, waiting only for Rick to commit his next major crime to justify a high-profile arrest. Most importantly, Andy and Gwen had discovered Rick's exit strategy. He maintained 3 separate identities with corresponding bank accounts and credit cards. On April 20th, 5 days after the wedding, he planned to transfer the home equity loan money to an offshore account, then vanish using a passport in the name of Michael Thompson. Diane knew nothing about any of this. She was planning their wedding with the excitement of a woman who believed she'd found her soulmate. Vinny watched through surveillance photos as she shopped for a dress, chose flowers, and called venues. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him. She was planning the celebration of her own destruction. Friday night, April 14th, Vinny flew to Las Vegas. He checked into the Bellagio under an assumed name, 2 floors above the suite where Rick and Diane would spend their wedding night. Marcus Wade was already in position with the surveillance team. Jimmy Torino had arrived with 2 associates who specialized in what he called aggressive debt collection. The wedding was held at a tacky chapel on the Strip, attended only by Diane and Rick plus 2 witnesses they had hired from a service. Vinny watched from across the street, wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap, feeling nothing as his ex-wife pledged her love to a man who was planning to destroy her life. After the ceremony, Rick and Diane had dinner at an expensive restaurant in their hotel. Vinny could have crashed their celebration, could have warned Diane what was coming, could have given her one last chance to walk away. Instead, he returned to his room and waited. At 2:47 a.m., Marcus Wade called with confirmation. Rick had accessed his computer and begun the process of setting up the home equity loan. He was working with a corrupt mortgage broker in Portland who specialized in fast approvals for clients who asked no questions. By Monday, Rick would have a check for $350,000, money secured by Diane's house and Vinny's legal liability as co-owner. At 3:15 a.m., Vinny made a phone call that would change everything. "This is Agent Sarah Mitchell." The FBI agent answered on the first ring. "It's time," Vinny said simply. Are you certain? Once we move, there's no going back. I'm certain. The arrest will happen Monday morning when he attempts to deposit the check. Are you prepared for the fallout? Vinny looked out his hotel window at the lights of Las Vegas, thinking about Trevor, about the betrayal that had destroyed his marriage, about the years of careful planning that had led to this moment. I've been prepared for 8 years. Monday morning, April 18th, Rick drove to his corrupt mortgage broker's office in Northeast Portland to finalize the home equity loan. He was dressed in an expensive suit, carrying a briefcase, and driving Diane's BMW. He believed he was 96 hours away from disappearing forever with enough money to start fresh somewhere else. Instead, he walked into the largest federal fraud sting operation in Oregon state history. The mortgage broker's office had been under FBI surveillance for 6 months. Rick's arrival with fraudulent documentation and identity papers was the final piece of evidence they needed. As he signed the loan papers that would steal Diane's house and destroy her credit, federal agents burst through the doors with weapons drawn. Robert Christopher Henley, you're under arrest for federal fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. Rick's first instinct was to run. His second was to claim innocence. His third was to demand a lawyer. All three failed. The evidence against him filled 14 boxes: surveillance footage, financial records, testimony from previous victims, and digital forensics that traced every crime back to its source. Andy Nguyen's computer work had been thorough enough to impress the FBI's own cybercrimes unit. But the real surprise came when the agents also arrested the mortgage broker, 2 bank officials, and a real estate attorney who'd been facilitating Rick's schemes. Vinny's investigation had uncovered an entire network of corruption that the FBI had been hunting for years. As Rick was being processed into federal custody, Diane was served with civil suits from 7 different women seeking restitution for crimes committed by her new husband. She was also informed that her marriage was invalid. Rick's previous marriage in Arizona had never been legally dissolved. By Tuesday morning, Diane's world had completely collapsed. Her husband was a federal fugitive who'd been using her identity for fraud. Her house was in foreclosure due to mortgage irregularities. Her bank accounts were frozen pending investigation, and she had no one to call for help because Rick had convinced her to cut ties with everyone who'd ever cared about her. Everyone except Vinny. Chapter 7. The Reckoning Begins. Diane called Vinny from a payphone outside the federal courthouse on Tuesday afternoon. Her voice was small and broken, nothing like the confident woman who'd slapped him and demanded he leave his own home. They took everything, she said without preamble. The house, the cars, my bank accounts. They say he was married to someone else. That nothing we did was legal. Vinny listened without speaking, standing in his auto shop office where he'd returned to rebuild his life one customer at a time. Through the window, he could see Lou Garrett training a new mechanic, the business finally thriving again after years of careful growth. I need help, Diane continued. I don't have anywhere to go. No money for a lawyer. The FBI wants me to testify, but they won't tell me if I'm in trouble too. What do you want from me? Vinny asked quietly. I don't know. I call my sister, but she won't talk to me. My friends from work say they can't get involved. You're the only person who what? The only person who might not hate me enough to hang up. Vinny closed his eyes, remembering the night she'd chosen Rick over their marriage. The sound of her palm striking his face, the years of silence that followed. Why would I help you? Because I know I destroyed everything. Because I was wrong about Rick, wrong about us, wrong about everything. Because her voice broke. Because Trevor would want you to. The mention of their son hit like a physical blow. Diane had lost the right to invoke Trevor's memory the night she chose her affair over her family. But she was desperate enough to try anyway. Meet me at Denny's on Powell Boulevard in an hour, Vinny said. Come alone. She was waiting in a corner booth when he arrived, looking smaller and older than he remembered. Her expensive clothes were wrinkled. Her makeup was smeared from crying, and her hands shook as she held her coffee cup. For a moment, Vinny felt a flicker of the old sympathy he'd once felt for her. Then he remembered Trevor asking why Mommy seemed sad during her hospital visits, not knowing his mother was distracted by text messages from her lover. I need you to know something, Vinny said, sliding into the booth across from her. I've known about Rick for 3 years. Diane's eyes widened. What? I knew he was a con man. I knew about the other women, the fake identities, the financial crimes. I knew he was planning to steal your house and disappear. Then why didn't you warn me? Vinny studied her face, looking for any trace of the woman he'd once loved. Because you made your choice. When you slapped me and told me to get out. When you chose him over our marriage, you chose whatever came next. But you could have saved me from this. Could I? Vinny leaned forward. What would you have done if I'd called you 3 years ago and told you Rick was a criminal? Would you have believed me? Or would you have accused me of lying because I was jealous? Diane's silence was answer enough. You threw away 15 years of marriage for a man you'd known 6 months, Vinny continued. You brought him into our house while our son's memory was still fresh. You chose to trust a stranger over your husband. So I let you live with the consequences of that choice. You let me get conned. I'll let you get exactly what you were looking for, a life without me in it. Diane started crying again, the ugly, desperate sobs of someone who'd lost everything through her own choices. What am I supposed to do now? Vinny pulled an envelope from his jacket and placed it on the table between them. Rick's real name is Robert Christopher Henley. He's been running cons for 15 years. The FBI has evidence of fraud in 6 states. His previous victims are suing him for millions. How do you know all this? Because I've been documenting his crimes since the week he moved into our house. Every financial transaction, every fake identity, every woman he's destroyed. I've been building a case against him for 8 years. Diane stopped crying, staring at him with growing comprehension. You planned this. You set him up. I gave him enough rope to hang himself. Rick destroyed his own life by being exactly who he was. I just made sure there were consequences. But what about me? I didn't know. You knew enough, Vinny interrupted. You knew I called his work and discovered he didn't exist. You knew his story kept changing. You knew he was pushing you to cut ties with everyone who cared about you. You chose to ignore every red flag because you wanted what he was selling. He stood up to leave, then paused. The FBI will probably offer you immunity if you cooperate fully. Tell them everything. When you met him, what he told you, how he controlled your finances. Help them build the strongest possible case. Why are you telling me this? Vinny looked down at the broken woman who'd once been his wife and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. Because I want Rick to spend the maximum possible time in federal prison. And I want you to live with knowing that you chose him over us. He walked away, leaving her alone with the wreckage of the life she'd chosen. But the reckoning was far from over. Chapter 8. The Trial of Consequences. Rick's federal trial began 14 months later, in June of the following year. By then, the case had grown into one of the largest fraud prosecutions in Oregon history. 7 victims testified about how Rick had systematically destroyed their lives. The FBI presented evidence of over $2 million in theft across multiple states. Financial experts explained the sophisticated laundering schemes he'd used to hide his crimes. But the prosecution's most devastating witness was Diane herself. She testified for 3 days, describing in excruciating detail how Rick had manipulated her emotions, isolated her from support systems, and gradually taken control of her finances. Her testimony was compelling precisely because she wasn't trying to excuse her own behavior. She admitted to every poor choice, every ignored warning sign, every moment when she'd chosen to trust Rick over her own instincts. The defense tried to paint her as a willing accomplice, but the evidence was overwhelming. Rick had run the same con on 7 other women, using identical tactics and manipulation strategies. Diane was a victim, even if she'd made herself an easy target through her own selfishness and poor judgment. Vinny attended every day of the trial, sitting in the back of the courtroom like a silent witness to justice. He watched Rick try to charm the jury, watched him blame his victims for their gullibility, watched him show no remorse for the devastation he'd caused. When the guilty verdict was read, guilty on all 23 federal counts, Rick finally lost his composure. He screamed at the judge that he'd been framed, that his victims were liars, that the system was corrupt. U.S. Marshals had to physically restrain him as he was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. After the sentencing, Diane approached Vinny in the courthouse hallway. She'd spent the past year working as a cashier at a grocery store, living in a studio apartment, and attending court-mandated financial counseling. The experience had aged her, but there was something different in her eyes, a humility that hadn't been there before. "I know you'll never forgive me," she said quietly, "but I wanted to thank you for giving me the information I needed to help convict him." "I didn't do it for you," Vinny replied. "I did it for justice." "I know. I also know that you could have destroyed me completely if you'd wanted to. The fact that you didn't. Don't mistake necessity for mercy," Vinny cut her off. "You were useful to the prosecution. That's the only reason you're not in federal prison yourself." Diane nodded, accepting the harsh truth. "What happens now? Now you live with the consequences of your choices, just like I've lived with mine." She started to walk away, then turned back. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if things had been different? If I'd chosen you instead of him?" Vinny considered the question seriously. "No," he said finally, "because the woman who would have chosen me over him wouldn't have been having an affair in the first place." After Diane left, Vinny remained in the courthouse for another hour, thinking about justice and revenge and the difference between the two. Rick would spend the next 18 years in federal prison, where his charm and manipulation skills would be useless. His victims would receive restitution from seized assets, though money could never fully repair the damage he'd done. But for Vinny, the real victory wasn't Rick's imprisonment. It was the knowledge that he'd transformed his rage and grief into something purposeful. He'd taken the worst betrayal of his life and turned it into justice for people who'd never expected to see any. That evening, he drove to Riverside Cemetery and sat beside Trevor's grave. The headstone was simple: Trevor James Delacroix, beloved son, dreamer of impossible cars. "It's finished," he said aloud. "The man who hurt our family is in prison. The woman who betrayed us is living with the consequences." Justice was served. The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment, Vinny could almost hear his son's voice. "Good job, Dad." But what happens next? What happened next was the question that would define the rest of Vinny's life. He'd spent 8 years planning and executing the perfect revenge. Now, he had to decide what to do with the rest of his time on Earth. As he drove home to his small apartment above the Vietnamese restaurant, Vinny made a decision that would surprise everyone who thought they knew him. But that story would unfold in the final chapter of his transformation from grieving father to something much more dangerous. Chapter 9. 8 years later. The courtroom was packed on a gray November morning 8 years after Rick's conviction. Vinny sat at the plaintiff's table, wearing an expensive suit and the confident bearing of a man who'd rebuilt his life from ashes. Across the aisle, Diane sat with her court-appointed attorney, looking tired and defeated. Between them sat the reason for this final confrontation: Kyle Morrison, Rick's former cellmate who'd been released from federal prison 6 months earlier. Kyle had tracked down Diane with a story about Rick's secret stash of money hidden before his arrest. According to Kyle, Rick had told him about $300,000 buried in a storage unit, money that rightfully belonged to his wife. All Diane had to do was pay Kyle $50,000 for the location, and she could reclaim the hidden fortune. It was, of course, another con. Kyle was a career criminal who specialized in preying on previous fraud victims, using information gathered from fellow inmates to run secondary scams. He'd approached dozens of Rick's victims with similar stories, collecting finder's fees for treasure that didn't exist. But Kyle had made a critical error in targeting Diane. He'd underestimated how thoroughly Vinny had documented every aspect of Rick's criminal operation. "Your Honor," Vinny's attorney began, "8 years ago, my client discovered that his wife was having an affair with a career criminal. Rather than simply divorce her, Mr. Delacroix spent years building a federal case that resulted in the conviction of Robert Henley and the recovery of over $2 million for his victims." The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, reviewed the case file with obvious interest. This wasn't a typical civil matter. Mr. Delacroix maintained surveillance on Mr. Henley's operation for 3 years before the arrest, the attorney continued. During that time, he documented every financial transaction, every hidden asset, every criminal contact. There is no secret stash of money because my client accounted for every dollar Rick Henley stole. Kyle's attorney, a public defender who clearly wished he was anywhere else, made a weak argument about new evidence and recovered assets. But when Vinny's team presented 8 years of financial records, surveillance footage, and FBI cooperation agreements, Kyle's story collapsed completely. More damaging was the revelation that Kyle had been working this same scam across multiple states, targeting at least 30 victims with promises of hidden money that never existed. The FBI had been building a case against him, and his attempt to defraud Diane provided the final evidence they needed. But the real surprise came when the judge asked why Vinny was pursuing this case so aggressively. "Mr. Delacroix," she said, "you've already seen Mr. Henley convicted and imprisoned. Your ex-wife's financial situation isn't legally your responsibility. Why invest significant resources in stopping this relatively small fraud?" Vinny stood slowly, his eyes never leaving Diane's face. "Your Honor, 8 years ago my wife chose to destroy our marriage for a criminal who was planning to steal her life savings. I could have warned her, could have saved her from becoming a victim. Instead, I let her experience the full consequences of trusting the wrong person." The courtroom was completely silent. "I thought that would be enough," Vinny continued. "I thought watching her lose everything would satisfy my need for justice. But I was wrong. The real lesson wasn't about the consequences of betrayal. It was about the difference between justice and revenge." He gestured toward Kyle. "This man is a predator who targets people when they're most vulnerable. He specifically chose my ex-wife because he believed she was an easy mark, someone who'd already proven she could be manipulated by criminals." Vinny's voice grew harder. "I spent 8 years documenting Rick Henley's crimes not just for revenge, but to protect his future victims. Today, I'm here to ensure that Mr. Morrison faces consequences for his crimes, and that no one else falls victim to his scams." The judge studied Vinny for a long moment. "And what about your ex-wife? What consequences does she face in your version of justice?" "She faces the same consequence she's faced for 8 years, Your Honor. She has to live with the knowledge that her choices destroyed everything we built together, including our son's memory of a united family." For the first time during the proceedings, Diane spoke up. "Our son died before any of this happened. Don't use Trevor's memory to justify. Don't." Vinny's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. "Don't you dare invoke our son's name. You were cheating on our marriage while he was dying. You brought your lover into our house 2 weeks after we buried him. You chose your affair over Trevor's memory, and you chose it again every day for 8 years. Diane stood up, tears streaming down her face. "I know I was wrong. I know I destroyed everything. But holding on to this anger for 8 years, Trevor wouldn't want. Trevor would want his father to protect innocent people from predators," Vinny interrupted. "He would want justice for victims who can't fight for themselves. And he would want the people who betrayed his family to face real consequences, not just convenient forgiveness." The judge banged her gavel, restoring order. After reviewing the evidence, she ruled in Vinny's favor on all counts. Kyle Morrison was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for fraud. Diane was ordered to pay restitution for her role in attempting to access the non-existent hidden money. But more importantly, the judge ordered a full investigation into Kyle's other victims, potentially bringing justice to dozens of people who'd been scammed by Rick's former cellmate. As the courtroom cleared, Diane approached Vinny one final time. "When does it end?" she asked quietly. "When you finally let go of the anger?" Vinny looked at the woman who'd once been his wife, the mother of his dead son, the person who'd chosen betrayal over loyalty when he needed her most. "It ends when justice is served completely. When every predator who targeted you faces consequences. When every victim gets restitution. When a system that failed to protect people like you is fixed. And then I move on to the next case. Because there's always another Rick Henley, another Kyle Morrison, another person who thinks they could destroy innocent lives without consequences." Diane stared at him with something approaching fear. "What did you become?" Vinny straightened his tie and picked up his briefcase. "I became someone who doesn't forgive or forget. Someone who believes that justice delayed is justice denied. Someone who understands that the only way to stop predators is to make them afraid of the consequences. He walked away, leaving Diane alone with the weight of her choices and the knowledge that some betrayals create enemies that never stop hunting. Outside the courthouse, Vinny's phone rang. It was Marcus Wade, calling about a new case, a veteran who'd been defrauded by a fake charity. Another victim who needed justice. Another predator who needed to learn that some people fight back. Vinny smiled as he answered the call. This was what he'd become, a weapon wielded by the wronged against those who wronged them. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the life his experiences had forged. And somewhere in the distance, he could almost hear Trevor's voice saying, "Good job, Dad." Now, to our wonderful community at Infidelity Tales Lab, welcome and thank you. Your presence keeps us motivated. Quick question, what part of the globe are you tuning in from? Whether it's morning or night where you are, let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, The Mask of Normalcy. Russell Norwood was not a man who tolerated deception. In the high-stakes world of private equity where he'd made his fortune, he'd developed a reputation for brutal efficiency and an almost supernatural ability to detect lies. His colleagues called him the bloodhound behind his back, a nickname he secretly enjoyed. At 42, Russell had everything most men dreamed of: a sprawling colonial home in an exclusive neighborhood, a portfolio worth 8 figures, and what he had believed to be a loving wife of 7 years. Vanessa had been a paralegal when they met, intelligent and ambitious with a sharp wit that had drawn him in immediately. "You know what I find refreshing about you, Russell," she had said on their third date, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass. "You don't pretend to be nice." He'd laughed then. "Is that supposed to be a compliment?" "Absolutely," she'd replied with that enigmatic smile. "Nice is boring. Nice is predictable. You're authentic." That conversation had sealed their fate. 6 months later, they were married in a lavish ceremony that made the society pages. Russell remembered how Dorothy, Vanessa's mother, had watched him throughout the reception with thinly veiled suspicion. She'd cornered him by the bar, her diamonds catching the light as she leaned in close. "My daughter could have had anyone," she'd whispered, her breath heavy with champagne. Just remember that. Russell had simply smiled and walked away. Dorothy Perkins was old Boston money with nothing left but the name. He knew she'd hoped Vanessa would marry into a family with lineage rather than a self-made man with new money and no pedigree. For years, the marriage had been good, or so Russell had thought. Vanessa managed their social calendar with precision while he built his firm from a boutique agency into a powerhouse. They traveled extensively, maintained the right friendships, and if they hadn't had children yet, well, they had agreed that careers came first. The first crack appeared 3 years ago when Dorothy's investment advisor ran off with most of her fortune. Rather than allow his mother-in-law to face public humiliation, Russell had quietly paid off her debts and moved her into their guest house. Vanessa had been grateful, effusively so, but something shifted after Dorothy's arrival. "You work too much," Vanessa began saying. The sex dwindled. The conversations shortened. Dorothy's presence became a constant, her influence over Vanessa growing by the day. 8 months ago, Vanessa had approached him with an idea. "Mom and I want to start a small business," she'd said over dinner. "Just crafts, really. Artisanal soaps, candles, that sort of thing. We could use the home office since you're hardly ever there." Russell had agreed, seeing it as an opportunity for Vanessa to occupy herself and perhaps loosen Dorothy's grip. He'd even helped them set up a limited liability company, Perkins Artisanal Goods, and had his accountant show them the basics of business finance. Looking back, he should have seen the signs. The late-night inventory sessions, the steady stream of packages, the new friends Vanessa never introduced him to, the hushed phone calls that ended when he entered a room. But he'd been distracted by the Harrington acquisition, a complex deal that had consumed him for months. By the time he started paying attention to what was happening in his own home, the foundation was already crumbling beneath his feet. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. Russell had received a text from a block number while in a board meeting. "Your house is being watched." Not by us. There was no signature, no explanation. Just those 8 words that sent ice through his veins. Chapter 2, beneath the surface. The anonymous text message nagged at Russell as he left his office early, breaking his usual pattern of working until 8. He drove home with a growing sense of unease, taking a circuitous route and checking his rearview mirror frequently. Old habits from his early days when he navigated the sharky waters of venture capital with competitors watching his every move. As he approached his neighborhood, Russell pulled into the parking lot of a local coffee shop and called his head of security, Boyd Walton, a former FBI agent who now handled private contracts. "Boyd, I need surveillance on my house. Discreet, starting immediately. Problem at home, Russ?" Boyd's voice was carefully neutral. "Just a precaution. And I need you to pull records for all deliveries to my address for the past 6 months. Courier services, postal, everything. Will do. Anything else?" Russell hesitated. "Yes. I want to know who's watching my property." "Someone's watching you?" The professional neutrality in Boyd's voice slipped. "That's what I need to confirm. Give me answers by tomorrow." Russell hung up and sat in his car for several minutes, thinking. Then he called his attorney, Philip Maddox. "Phil, I need a favor off the books." "Those are getting expensive." "Russell," Philip replied, but his tone was light. "I need you to prepare documentation transferring all my personal assets to the Cayman Shell. Backdated appropriately." A pause. "That sounds like you're expecting trouble. Just a contingency. And Phil, I may need you to show up unannounced. If I text you 911 home, drop everything and come to my house with those papers." "Russell, you're scaring me a little. What's going on?" "Hopefully nothing. But if it's something, I want to be prepared." Russell arrived home to find Vanessa and Dorothy in the kitchen, preparing dinner together, an unusual sight. They both startled when he walked in. "You're home early," Vanessa said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Thought I'd surprise you." Russell kissed her cheek, noticing how she subtly pulled away. "Something smells good." "Coke au vin," Dorothy said, her hands fidgeting with her apron. Vanessa's been taking French cooking classes. This was news to Russell. "Have you? Where?" "Just online," Vanessa replied quickly. "Something to do while you're working." Russell nodded, watching them exchange glances. "Mind if I check some emails in the office before dinner?" "Actually," Vanessa said, "we have inventory spread out everywhere in there. It's a mess. Why don't you use the study instead?" "Sure." Russell smiled. "No problem." He walked upstairs to the study, which overlooked the driveway, and watched as a dark sedan drove slowly past the house, then circled back and parked across the street. The windows were tinted, but he could make out the silhouette of someone watching the house. That night, after Vanessa fell asleep, Russell slipped out of bed and made his way to the home office. The door was locked, another recent change. Using the spare key he'd quietly made weeks earlier, he let himself in. The room had been transformed. What had once been his workspace now looked like a small factory. There were boxes of packaging materials, label makers, and various crafting supplies. But in the corner, partially hidden behind a folding screen, sat something that made his blood run cold. A professional-grade heat press and what appeared to be a specialized printer. Russell carefully photographed everything without disturbing the setup, then examined the labels on some of the boxes. They bore the logos of high-end designer brands: Gucci, Louis Vuitton, Prada. A drawer in the desk contained sample tags and authenticity cards that looked indistinguishable from the real thing. His wife wasn't running a craft business. She was manufacturing counterfeit designer goods. As Russell was about to leave, his phone pinged with a message from Boyd. 2 watchers. 1 FBI commercial fraud division. 1 unknown, possibly organized crime connection. Call me ASAP. Russell quietly locked the office and returned to bed, lying awake beside his sleeping wife. The pieces were falling into place, and none of them formed a picture he wanted to see. The next morning, Russell received a detailed report from Boyd. The unknown watcher was connected to the Vitali crime family, specifically to their counterfeiting operations. The delivery records showed regular packages from China and Turkey, common sources for raw materials used in counterfeiting luxury goods. And most damning of all, there were regular cash deposits into a bank account under Perkins' artisanal goods that totaled over $300,000 in the past 6 months. Russell maintained his routine, leaving for work at his usual time, but instead of going to his office, he met with Boyd and Philip at a hotel downtown. "So my wife and mother-in-law are running a counterfeiting operation from my home office," Russell said flatly, staring out the window at the city skyline. "And they've somehow gotten involved with the Vitali family." Philip whistled low. "That's federal prison time, Russell. Trademark counterfeiting at this scale carries up to 10 years. The FBI surveillance suggests they're building a case," Boyd added. "They typically observe for weeks before moving in. They're probably documenting the distribution network." Russell turned to them, his expression hardening. "I need to know everything. Who they're working with, where the money's going, and most importantly, who else is involved." "You think there's someone else?" Philip asked. Russell's jaw tightened. "Vanessa's smart, but she doesn't have the connections to set something like this up. Someone introduced her to this world." He didn't share his darkest suspicion, that his wife's sudden distance might be connected to more than just her criminal enterprise. But first, he needed proof. "Boyd, I want surveillance on Vanessa when she leaves the house. And I want to know every person she meets with." "Russell," Philip said cautiously, "what exactly are you planning?" Russell's face was a mask of cold determination. "I'm planning to find out who's trying to set me up to take the fall, and then I'm going to make sure they regret it." Chapter 3. The Setup. Russell spent the next 3 days maintaining the illusion of normalcy while gathering intelligence. Boyd's team followed Vanessa to a series of meetings, including one with a man identified as Maxwell Lobo Wallace, a mid-level operative in the Vitali organization who specialized in distribution of counterfeit goods. More troubling was her meeting with a man Boyd couldn't immediately identify. Tall, well-dressed, driving a Maserati. They met at an upscale hotel bar in the financial district and, based on the surveillance photos, seemed intimately familiar with each other. "Got a name for our mystery man," Boyd said, calling Russell while he was at lunch with clients. "Anthony Keller. Goes by Tony. Former customs officer. Now works as a consultant for import businesses. Has connections to both legitimate luxury retailers and the black market." "And his connection to my wife?" Russell asked, keeping his voice neutral despite the growing knot in his stomach. Boyd hesitated. They checked into the hotel, Russell. Room was booked for 3 hours. Russell absorbed this information with a cold detachment that surprised even him. "I see. Keep following the thread." That evening at home, Russell watched Vanessa move around the kitchen, noting how she checked her phone every few minutes. She seemed on edge, jumpy. "Everything okay?" he asked, sipping his bourbon. "You seem distracted." "Just busy with the business," she said, not meeting his eyes. "We have a big order to fulfill this week. Anything I can help with?" She looked up sharply. "No. You have your work, I have mine." "Fair enough." He paused. "How about we go away this weekend? We haven't had time alone in months." "I can't," she said quickly. "Mom and I have a craft fair in Providence." Russell nodded, knowing there was no craft fair. According to Boyd, she had a meeting scheduled with Lobo Wallace to hand off a major shipment. "Another time, then." That night, Russell received a text from an unknown number. "Walk away from the heart deal, or your wife's activities become your problem." The heart deal was a sensitive acquisition Russell's firm was managing, a pharmaceutical company with promising patents. The threat confirmed his suspicion. Someone was using Vanessa's counterfeiting operation as leverage against him. The next morning, Russell kissed Vanessa goodbye, as usual, but instead of heading to work, he met with a former colleague who now worked for the DEA. "I need to know if the FBI is planning to move on a counterfeiting operation," Russell explained, keeping details vague. "It's related to the Hart acquisition." His contact made some calls. "Word is they're moving tomorrow morning. Commercial Fraud Division, with support from local PD." Russell thanked him and immediately called Philip. "Tomorrow's the day. Be ready." He spent the rest of the day preparing, transferring funds to secure accounts, and ensuring his contingency plans were in place. That evening, he made a show of telling Vanessa he had an early meeting the next day. "I'll be gone before you're up," he said casually. "That's fine," she replied, distracted by her phone. "Mom and I have a lot of work to do anyway." Russell pretended to go to sleep early, but instead lay awake, listening as Vanessa slipped out of bed around midnight and went downstairs. He heard muffled conversation, then the sound of Dorothy's voice growing more heated. They were arguing about something. Morning came, and Russell left as promised but parked 2 blocks away, watching his house through binoculars. At precisely 8:47 a.m., 4 unmarked cars and 2 police cruisers converged on his property. He waited until the officers had entered before driving back and pulling into his driveway. As he stepped out of his car, he saw exactly what he'd expected: officers carrying boxes of counterfeit goods out of his home office. What he hadn't expected was the look of rehearsed terror on Vanessa's face as she spotted him. She immediately pointed in his direction. "He made me do it," she cried out, her voice carrying across the lawn. "Russell forced us to run the operation. He threatened us." Dorothy stood beside her, nodding dramatically, wiping obviously fake tears from her eyes. "He said he'd cut us off completely if we didn't help him," she added, her voice breaking. "We were terrified." A detective approached Russell. "Sir, I'm Detective Cooper with Boston PD. We have a warrant to search these premises for counterfeit goods and related materials." "Understand," Russell said calmly. "But I can assure you, Detective, this is the first I'm hearing about any counterfeiting operation in my home." "That's a lie," Vanessa shouted. "He coordinated everything. The suppliers, the distribution, it was all him." Detective Cooper gave Russell a hard look. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me for questioning." As the detective reached for his handcuffs, a sleek black Audi pulled into the driveway, and Philip Maddox emerged, carrying a leather briefcase. "Detective Cooper," Philip called out, striding confidently toward them. "Philip Maddox, attorney for Mr. Norwood. I must insist you release my client immediately." Cooper frowned. "Your client is implicated in a federal counterfeiting operation, counselor." "Is he?" Philip opened his briefcase and removed a file. "Then perhaps you can explain why Mr. Norwood has been in Zurich for the past 3 months, overseeing the European expansion of his firm." "I have his passport, stamped entry and exit records, hotel receipts, and sworn statements from his business associates confirming his presence at daily meetings." Russell watched as Vanessa's face drained of color. Dorothy grabbed her daughter's arm for support. "Furthermore," Philip continued, "I have here documentation showing that Mr. Norwood transferred ownership of this property to his wife 6 months ago, retaining only minimal visitation rights during his brief returns to the States. He has had no access to or control over the home office where these alleged counterfeit goods were manufactured." Cooper examined the documents, his expression shifting from certainty to doubt. "These appear to be in order, but we'll need to verify their authenticity." "Of course," Philip agreed smoothly. "In the meantime, unless you have evidence directly linking Mr. Norwood to these activities, evidence that would somehow contradict these legal documents and multiple witness statements, I suggest you focus your investigation elsewhere." Cooper conferred with another officer, then reluctantly nodded. "Mr. Norwood, you're free to go for now, but don't leave town. We may have additional questions." As the officers continued their work, Russell turned to face Vanessa and Dorothy. His wife's expression had transformed from fake terror to genuine fear. "Russell," she began, her voice shaking, "I can't explain." "Save it." He cut her off, his voice low and controlled. "We both know what you try to do." Dorothy stepped forward, her previous tears now completely dry. "Now, Russell, don't be hasty. This is all a misunderstanding. Is it, Dorothy?" Russell's smile was glacial. "I think it's perfectly clear. The only misunderstanding was mine, believing you two had any loyalty or decency." He turned to Philip. "I'd like to go now." As they walked to Philip's car, Russell heard Vanessa call his name, a note of desperation in her voice. He didn't look back. "That went exactly as you predicted," Philip said once they were driving away. "But you know they'll challenge those documents eventually. They're good forgeries, but they won't hold up to serious scrutiny." "They don't need to," Russell replied, watching his house recede in the side mirror. "They just need to buy me time." "Time for what?" Russell's expression hardened. "Time to dismantle their entire operation and everyone connected to it, starting with Anthony Keller." Chapter 4: The Spider's Web. Russell established a command center in a penthouse suite at the Archer Hotel, paid for in cash under a different name. The room's dining table disappeared beneath laptops, financial records, and surveillance photos. Boyd had expanded his team to include a forensic accountant, a digital security expert, and 2 more field operatives. "Your wife's been busy," the accountant, a severe woman named Diana, explained as she walked Russell through the financial trail. The counterfeiting operation grossed nearly $2 million in the past year, with money moving through 6 different shell companies before landing in offshore accounts. Russell studied the diagram she'd created. "Those aren't Vanessa's accounts. She doesn't have the expertise to set this up." "Correct," Diana confirmed. "The beneficial owner appears to be Anthony Keller, though he's well insulated." Russell stared at the photo of Keller, handsome in a polished, artificial way, pinned to the evidence board. The man who'd been sleeping with his wife while using her to run his counterfeiting operation. The man who'd apparently decided Russell would make a convenient fall guy when the operation got too hot. "What's Keller's endgame?" Russell asked. "Using my wife to manufacture counterfeits is one thing, but why try to frame me specifically?" Boyd handed him a folder. "We think it's connected to this." Inside was information about the Hart Pharmaceuticals acquisition that Russell's firm was managing. Hart had developed a promising new treatment for pancreatic cancer, and their patents alone were worth billions. "Keller has connections to Meridian Biotech," Boyd explained. "They're Hart's main competitor, and they've been trying to block the acquisition." The pieces clicked into place. "So Keller was working 2 angles," Russell mused. "Using my home for his counterfeiting operation while pressuring me to drop the Hart deal. Well, I didn't back off. He decided to eliminate you as a problem," Boyd finished. Russell's phone chimed with a text from Philip. "Vanessa and Dorothy released pending further investigation. No charges filed yet. They're looking for you." "Let them look," Russell muttered. Over the next few days, Russell immersed himself in understanding every aspect of Keller's operation. The man had constructed an impressive network. As a former customs officer, Keller had inside knowledge of how shipments were inspected and which officials could be bribed. He used that expertise to build a counterfeiting empire, importing raw materials and distributing finished products through a web of seemingly legitimate businesses. Vanessa's role had been ideal. A wealthy, respectable woman with no criminal record, whose husband's reputation and resources provided perfect cover. Dorothy, it turned out, had been the connection. Before her financial troubles, she dated a man connected to the Vitali family who had introduced her to Keller. The most disturbing discovery came when Boyd's digital expert, a former NSA contractor named Ellis, recovered deleted text from a cloud backup of Vanessa's phone. "It's all arranged." Vanessa had written to Keller 3 months earlier. "The FBI will find everything they need to connect Russell to the operation. Once he's arrested, I'll file for divorce, citing criminal activity, and take half of everything." Keller's response: "And once the Hart deal collapses, Meridian stock will soar. We'll make millions on our options." Russell read the exchange multiple times, his expression unchanging. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. "They've been planning this for months." "There's more," Ellis said uncomfortably. "The personal messages between them, they've been involved for over a year." Russell nodded, unsurprised. "Show me everything." Ellis hesitated, then brought up a series of exchanges that left no doubt about the nature of Vanessa and Keller's relationship. Messages about their future together, about how Russell was too absorbed in his work to notice what was happening under his nose, about their plans for after his downfall. "I almost feel bad for him," Vanessa had written. "He trusted me completely." "Don't waste sympathy," Keller had replied. "He's collateral damage. Besides, he'll still have his reputation when we're done. Just not his fortune or his freedom." Russell's face betrayed nothing as he read their intimate exchanges, their cruel jokes at his expense, their detailed plans for his destruction. When he finished, he closed the laptop and stood up. "I think we have everything we need," he said calmly. That night, alone in the hotel bedroom, Russell finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of Vanessa's betrayal. He'd given her everything: his name, his trust, his protection when her mother needed it. In return, she'd plotted his ruin while sharing another man's bed. For the first time since this began, Russell felt a white-hot rage building inside him. But by morning, That rage had cooled into something far more dangerous: absolute resolve. When Boyd arrived the next morning, he found Russell dressed impeccably in a charcoal suit, reviewing documents with methodical precision. "You okay?" Boyd asked. Russell looked up, his eyes clear and focused. "I've never been better. Today we start dismantling Anthony Keller's life piece by piece. The FBI will move on him eventually," Boyd pointed out, "once they finish processing the evidence from your house." "The FBI moves too slowly," Russell interrupted, "and they're constrained by laws and procedures." "I'm not." Boyd studied him carefully. "What exactly are you planning, Russell?" Russell gestured to the whiteboard where he'd outlined a comprehensive strategy. "First, we cut off his money, then his connections, then his protection. By the time I'm finished, Anthony Keller will have nothing and no one." "And Vanessa?" Boyd asked quietly. A cold smile touched Russell's lips. "My wife made her choice. She'll learn what that choice costs." Chapter 5. Threads of Deception. Russell's first target was Keller's financial foundation. Through Diana's analysis, they identified the main revenue streams from the counterfeiting operation and the legitimate businesses Keller used as fronts. Chief among these was a high-end import company called Lux Verified, which supposedly authenticated luxury goods, but actually served as the primary distribution channel for the counterfeits. "Keller owns 60% of Lux through a shell company," Diana explained. "The remaining 40% is split between 3 silent partners. Their client list includes some major department stores and online retailers who believe they're getting genuine, authenticated goods." Russell studied the company structure. "Who's the most vulnerable partner?" Diana pointed to a name: Andrea Moretti. "She provided initial capital, but isn't involved in operations. Her main business is real estate development." "Perfect." Russell picked up his phone. "Time to make a new friend." Through his extensive business network, Russell arranged an introduction to Andrea at a charity gala that weekend. She was an elegant woman in her 50s with a shrewd business mind. Russell approached her with a real estate opportunity, a distressed shopping center his firm had acquired in a portfolio liquidation. "I've heard you work wonders with retail spaces," he said, after establishing rapport. "This property has potential, but it needs the right vision." Andrea was intrigued, and they arranged to meet for lunch the following week. Over the next few days, Russell had Boyd's team assemble a comprehensive file on Lux Verified's actual operations, complete with documentation showing how the company was distributing counterfeits to unsuspecting retailers. At lunch, Russell waited until after their business discussion before casually mentioning, "I understand you're an investor in Lux Verified." Andrea nodded, sipping her wine. "A small stake. Anthony Keller manages most of it." "Do you know Anthony?" "Not personally," Russell replied, "but I've been learning a great deal about his operation recently." He slid a folder across the table. Andrea opened it, her expression shifting from curiosity to shock to alarm as she paged through the contents. "This can't be right," she whispered. "Every document in that file is authentic," Russell assured her. "Lux is selling counterfeits to legitimate retailers. When this breaks, and it will break, everyone involved faces federal charges and civil lawsuits that will run into the millions." Andrea's face had gone pale. "What do you want?" "2 things. First, sell your stake in Lux to my holding company for $1, effective immediately. Second, introduce me to the other partners as someone interested in investing." "Why would you want it on a business that's about to collapse?" Russell smiled thinly. "Let me worry about that. Do we have a deal, or would you prefer I take this information to the FBI?" By the end of the week, Russell owned 40% of Lux Verified and had meetings scheduled with the remaining partners. Each received the same evidence and the same offer. By the following Friday, Russell controlled 100% of Keller's primary distribution channel without Keller knowing anything had changed. Simultaneously, Russell moved against Keller's relationship with the Vitali crime family. Through Boyd's connections, he arranged a meeting with Riccardo Vitali, the family's consigliere, at a secluded restaurant in the North End. Vitali was a thin, elegant man who looked more like an accountant than a mobster. He listened impassively as Russell laid out everything he knew about Keller's operation, including evidence that Keller was skimming profits that should have gone to the Vitale family. Mr. Keller has been using my home and my wife for his operation, Russell explained. He attempted to frame me when things got hot. I have no quarrel with your family, but I thought you should know exactly who you're dealing with. Vitale studied Russell with calculating eyes. Why come to me with this? You could go to the feds. The feds would shut down the entire operation. I'm only interested in Keller. Once he's removed, I believe we could establish a more equitable arrangement. You're proposing to take over Keller's position? Vitale seemed amused. I'm proposing a clean transition with better returns and less risk, Russell corrected. My network and resources far exceed Keller's. You'd find me a more valuable partner. Vitale leaned back. This is the man who's sleeping with your wife. Yes? And you want to do business with us? Business is business, Russell replied coldly. Personal matters are separate. Not in my experience, Vitale said. But I appreciate your directness. I'll consider what you've shared. Russell knew the seed had been planted. The Vitales wouldn't tolerate theft, and they'd be watching Keller closely now. One more pressure point applied. The third prong of Russell's attack targeted Keller's relationship with Meridian Biotech. Through careful manipulation of trading records and a series of anonymous tips to financial journalists, Russell created a paper trail suggesting Keller was engaged in insider trading related to the Hart acquisition. By the end of the second week, Keller's world was beginning to unravel, though he didn't yet realize the source. Lux Verified's operations were mysteriously disrupted by shipment problems and customs delays. His Vitale family contacts became suddenly distant, and a Wall Street Journal reporter started asking uncomfortable questions about his connection to Meridian Biotech. Throughout this period, Russell maintained complete radio silence with Vanessa, though he knew she was trying desperately to reach him. She'd left dozens of messages, each more frantic than the last, cycling through explanations, excuses, and finally threats. You can't just disappear, her latest voicemail said. We need to talk about what happens next. I've spoken to a divorce attorney. If you don't respond, I'll have no choice but to proceed with a filing that includes all your business irregularities. Russell played this message for Philip, who shook his head. She's bluffing. She knows any investigation would uncover her own activities. She's panicking, Russell corrected. Keller's feeling the pressure, which means she is too. Boyd entered with fresh surveillance photos. Keller met with Vanessa today. It didn't look friendly. The photos showed Keller and Vanessa in his car, clearly arguing. In the final image, Vanessa was crying as Keller gripped her arm. Russell studied the photos dispassionately. He's realizing she's a liability now. Everything's proceeding exactly as planned. Philip looked concerned. Russell, I understand your anger, but Vanessa could be in actual danger if Keller thinks she's a threat. Then she should have chosen her partners more carefully, Russell replied without emotion. Now it's time for Phase 2. Chapter 6, The Architect's Blueprint. 3 weeks after the police raid, Russell finally reached out to Vanessa via text. We need to talk. Archer Hotel, Suite 1506, tomorrow, 2 p.m. Come alone. When Vanessa arrived at the hotel suite, she found Russell sitting calmly at the dining table, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, looking as though their world hadn't imploded. The room was minimalist, but clearly expensive. Russell, she breathed, relief evident in her voice. Thank God. I've been trying to reach you for weeks. Have a seat, Vanessa. His tone was professionally courteous, as if addressing a business associate rather than his wife. She hesitated, then sat across from him. She looked thinner than he remembered, dark circles under her eyes, her usual impeccable appearance slightly frayed at the edges. Where have you been? She asked. The police have been looking for you to ask more questions. Have they? Russell raised an eyebrow. Strange that they haven't found me, considering I haven't left Boston. Vanessa fidgeted with her wedding ring. Russell, about what happened? I can explain. It wasn't what it looked like. Really? Russell slid a folder across the table. Because it looked like you were running a counterfeiting operation from our home while having an affair with Anthony Keller and plotting to frame me for federal crimes. Vanessa's face drained of color as she opened the folder to find printouts of her text exchanges with Keller. How did you? That's not important, Russell interrupted. What matters is that I know everything, Vanessa. Every detail of your relationship with Keller, every step of your plan to destroy me, every dollar you expected to gain from my downfall. Tears welled in her eyes. It wasn't my idea. Tony convinced me that you were going to leave me anyway. He said you had other women, that you were just waiting for the right time to cut me loose. Russell laughed, a cold, humorless sound. And you believed him? After 7 years of marriage, you took the word of a con man over mine. You were never home. Vanessa's voice rose. Always working, always distracted. Tony made me feel special, wanted, while plotting to send me to prison, Russell added flatly. How romantic. Vanessa wiped away tears. What do you want, Russell? Is this just to humiliate me before you file for divorce? Russell leaned forward, his expression suddenly intense. I want you to understand exactly what's happening. Right now, Anthony Keller's life is collapsing around him. His business partners have abandoned him. His criminal associates suspect him of theft. Federal investigators are circling, and he believes you're the weak link. Fear flickered across Vanessa's face. What are you talking about? I'm dismantling everything Keller built, Russell explained calmly. Piece by piece, connection by connection. And I've made sure he'll believe you're responsible. That's insane, Vanessa whispered. He'll come after you? Russell finished. Yes, I expect he will. Unless what? Unless you help me complete his destruction. Russell outlined his proposition. Vanessa would return to Keller, claiming she'd met with Russell only to try to extract information about his legal strategy. She would become Russell's eyes and ears, feeding him information while subtly encouraging Keller's growing paranoia. Why would I do this? Vanessa asked, her voice shaking. If Tony is as dangerous as you say. Because it's your only option, Russell said simply. The FBI has enough evidence to charge you both with multiple federal crimes. I'm the only thing standing between you and a lengthy prison sentence. You wouldn't, she challenged, though uncertainty crept into her voice. Russell slid another folder across the table. Wouldn't I? This contains every piece of evidence linking you directly to the counterfeiting operation. One call from me, and a U.S. attorney gets a copy. Vanessa stared at him, seeing a side of her husband she'd never encountered before. Calculated, ruthless, and completely unmoved by her tears. What about Dorothy? She asked finally. Your mother is already cooperating, Russell replied. She made her deal 2 days ago. This was a lie. Russell hadn't contacted Dorothy at all, but the shock and betrayal on Vanessa's face told him she believed it. The seed of doubt had been planted. Now mother and daughter would distrust each other as well. I need time to think, Vanessa said. You have until tomorrow morning, Russell replied, standing to indicate the meeting was over. 10 a.m. Yes or no? After that, I call the FBI. After Vanessa left, Boyd emerged from the bedroom where he'd been monitoring the conversation. She'll run straight to Keller, he predicted. Of course she will, Russell agreed. And she'll tell him exactly what I want him to hear, that I'm gathering evidence against him, that I have connections in federal law enforcement, that I'm coming for him. You're using your wife as bait, Boyd observed, not judgmentally, but with professional assessment. She made herself bait when she decided to betray me, Russell replied. I'm just ensuring she serves a purpose. That evening, Russell met with Philip to discuss the legal aspects of his plan. The attorney was concerned. What you're doing borders on witness tampering and obstruction of justice, Philip warned. Not to mention the potential for getting Vanessa seriously hurt. I'm not forcing her to do anything, Russell countered. She has choices. Bad ones, admittedly, but choices nonetheless. Philip sighed. And what's your endgame here? What happens when Keller realizes he's being set up? Russell's expression was chillingly calm. Then he'll do exactly what cornered rats always do. Something desperate and stupid. And when he does, I'll be waiting. The next morning, precisely at 10 a.m., Vanessa texted Russell. I'll do it. But I want immunity in writing. Russell smiled as he typed his response. Meet me at Philip's office at noon. Come alone. If Keller follows you, the deal is off. Everything was falling into place. The trap was set. Now all Russell had to do was wait for his targets to spring at themselves. Chapter 7. Checkmate in Motion. The chess pieces were moving exactly as Russell had anticipated. Vanessa, torn between fear of Keller and fear of prosecution, became his reluctant informant. Dorothy, isolated and suspicious after Russell's lie about her cooperation, retreated to a friend's house in Wellesley. And Keller, feeling the walls closing in, grew increasingly erratic. Russell maintained his command center at the Archer, monitoring developments through Boyd's surveillance team and Diana's financial tracking. The hard acquisition proceeded on schedule despite Meridian Biotech's desperate attempts to derail it. Russell attended board meetings and client presentations as if nothing in his personal life had imploded, projecting an aura of unflappable control that unnerved even his closest colleagues. The SEC has opened an investigation into Keller's trading activity, Philip reported, joining Russell for their daily briefing. Anonymous tips about his Meridian connections have caught their attention. Russell nodded, satisfied. And the Lux-verified situation? The new CEO you installed has been reviewing their authentication procedures, Boyd explained. Found shocking irregularities that necessitated contacting all their retail clients. Keller's been trying to get through to him for days, but mysteriously, his calls aren't being returned. The new CEO was Russell's former head of operations, a loyal employee who understood exactly what Russell wanted, a controlled implosion that would destroy Keller's credibility without bringing down the entire business. Vanessa reports that Keller's becoming unhinged, Boyd continued, checking his notes. Drinking heavily, lashing out. He's convinced someone's targeting him specifically, but can't figure out who. Has he threatened her? Russell asked, his tone clinically detached. Boyd hesitated. She says no, but the surveillance tells a different story. He grabbed her arm hard enough to leave bruises during their last meeting. Good, Russell said coldly. Document everything. We'll need it later. Philip exchanged concerned glances with Boyd. Russell, I understand your anger, but using your wife as a punching bag for Keller crosses a line. She crossed the line first, Russell replied without emotion. Besides, I'm not forcing her to stay with him. She's making that choice because she thinks it's her best option. And what happens when Keller snaps completely? Philip pressed. He has connections to violent criminals. This could escalate beyond your control. Russell smiled thinly. That's exactly what I'm counting on. The next phase of Russell's plan targeted the fragile alliance between Keller and the Vitali family. Using information obtained from Vanessa, Russell identified a warehouse in South Boston where a major shipment of counterfeit goods was being stored. Through an untraceable burner phone, he contacted Ricardo Vitali. Warehouse 17 on Dorchester Avenue. Tonight, Keller's moving the merchandise without your knowledge, bringing in his own people. Within hours, surveillance showed Vitali family soldiers converging on the warehouse. The resulting confrontation with Keller's men escalated into violence that required police intervention. 3 arrests were made, none of them Vitali associates, who had vanished before authorities arrived. Russell watched the news coverage with satisfaction. The incident would be the final nail in Keller's relationship with the Vitali family, who prized discretion above all. The following day, Vanessa called Russell in a panic. Tony knows, she said, her voice trembling. He knows I've been feeding you information. He found the burner phone you gave me. Where are you now? Russell asked calmly. In the bathroom at his condo. He's in the other room, talking to someone on the phone. Russell, he's saying he's going to make an example of me. I think he's going to hurt me. Stay calm, Russell instructed. Is there a window in the bathroom? Yes, but it's small and we're on the 5th floor. Lock the door. Tell him you're taking a shower. Then text me his exact address. I'll have someone there in 10 minutes. After hanging up, Russell turned to Boyd. Send Martinez to extract her. Then leak Keller's address to Detective Cooper. Anonymous tip about counterfeit goods. Boyd frowned. You're saving her? I'm ensuring she remains useful, Russell corrected, and creating the perfect opportunity to deliver Keller to the authorities. 30 minutes later, Boyd received confirmation that Martinez had successfully extracted Vanessa through the bathroom window using equipment from his former SWAT days. She was being brought to a safe house, shaken but unharmed. Meanwhile, Boston PD was surrounding Keller's building based on the anonymous tip. The timing couldn't have been better. Keller's rage at Vanessa's betrayal had led him to pull out his entire inventory of counterfeit samples and authentication materials, which were spread across his dining room table when police knocked on his door. Russell watched the feed from a traffic camera across from Keller's building, satisfaction coursing through him as he saw Keller being led out in handcuffs. "Now what?" Philip asked. "Now we move to the final phase," Russell replied, ensuring none of them ever recover from this. When Vanessa arrived at the safe house, Russell was waiting. She looked terrible, makeup smeared, hair disheveled, a bruise forming on her cheek where Keller had struck her. "You set me up," she accused, her voice hoarse from crying. "You knew he'd figure it out." "I anticipated it as a possibility," Russell acknowledged without remorse. "But you're alive, and Keller is in custody. That's what matters." "What matters?" Vanessa laughed bitterly. "My life is destroyed. I could go to prison. I have nothing left." "That's not entirely true," Russell said, sliding a document across the table. "This is a one-way ticket to Barcelona, a new passport in the name of Victoria Peters, and access to an account with enough money to start over. The account will be funded after you sign these papers." The papers were divorce documents, devastatingly one-sided. Vanessa would relinquish all claims to Russell's assets and business interests. She would admit to the counterfeiting operation and her affair in writing. She would agree never to contact Russell again or to return to the United States. "This is blackmail," she whispered. "This is mercy," Russell corrected. "You could be facing federal charges carrying up to 20 years. Instead, you get a new life far away from here. All you have to do is sign." Vanessa stared at the documents, then at her husband, this cold stranger who had once loved her. "Was any of it real?" she asked quietly. "Us, I mean." For a moment, something flickered in Russell's eyes, a ghost of the man he'd been before her betrayal. Then it vanished, replaced by implacable resolve. "It doesn't matter now," he said. "Sign the papers, Vanessa. It's your only way out." With a shaking hand, she signed each page. When she finished, Russell collected the documents without another word and walked to the door. "Russell," she called after him, "will I ever see you again?" He paused, his back to her. "If you do, it means you've broken our agreement. And trust me, Vanessa, you don't want to find out what happens then." The door closed behind him with quiet finality. Chapter 8. The Reckoning. Anthony Keller sat in an interrogation room at Boston Police Headquarters, his designer suit rumpled, his confident facade cracking. Across from him, Detective Cooper reviewed the evidence gathered from Keller's condo, samples of counterfeit goods, authentication materials, and financial records linking him to the distribution network. "You're looking at multiple federal charges," Cooper explained. "Trademark counterfeiting, conspiracy, interstate transport of stolen property. The U.S. Attorney's Office is talking about a 15-year minimum sentence." Keller leaned forward, desperation in his eyes. "Look, I can give you bigger fish. The Vitali family's entire operation. Names, dates, everything." "We're listening," Cooper said, though his expression suggested skepticism. "First, I want a deal in writing. Reduced charges, witness protection." Cooper nodded to his partner, who left the room, presumably to consult with prosecutors. In reality, he wanted to make a call that would ensure word of Keller's offer reached Ricardo Vitali within the hour. Across town, Russell met with the board of Lux Verified, now fully under his control. The company's legitimate business, authenticating luxury goods, would continue under new management with enhanced procedures. The counterfeiting operation had been surgically excised, with all evidence pointing solely to Keller. "The company's reputation will take a hit initially," Russell acknowledged to the board members, all recently installed allies. "But we'll position it as a necessary cleansing after discovering Keller's deception. Within 6 months, Lux will be the gold standard for authentication because we'll have proven our commitment to integrity." As Russell left the meeting, Boyd called with an update. "Keller's trying to flip on the Vitalis. Word's already spreading in their organization." "Perfect," Russell replied. "And Dorothy?" "Still at her friend's house in Wellesley. She's been calling Vanessa nonstop since yesterday, but obviously getting no response." "It's time to bring her in," Russell decided. "Have Martinez pick her up. Use whatever story works." Dorothy Perkins arrived at the safe house 2 hours later, escorted by Martinez, who had convinced her that Vanessa was in trouble and needed her mother. Instead, she found Russell waiting in a sparsely furnished living room. "Where's Vanessa?" she demanded, her imperious manner intact despite the circumstances. "Gone," Russell replied simply. "And if she's smart, she won't come back." Dorothy's face paled. "What have you done?" "What have I done?" Russell laughed without humor. "That's rich coming from the woman who helped set me up to take the fall for a federal crime." "It wasn't my idea," Dorothy protested quickly. "Tony Keller approached me after my investment troubles. He said it would be easy money, just using the home office when you weren't around. Then it escalated to framing me for everything while your daughter slept with him." Russell finished coldly. "Yes, I'm aware of how it escalated." Dorothy sank into a chair, suddenly looking every one of her 67 years. "What happens now? Are you going to turn me in?" Russell studied his mother-in-law, this woman who had looked down on him from the moment they met, who had never thought him good enough for her daughter despite his success and generosity. "That depends entirely on you, Dorothy," he said finally. "I'm prepared to offer you the same deal Vanessa took, a new identity, enough money to live comfortably far away from here, in exchange for signing some papers and disappearing permanently. And if I refuse?" Russell slid a folder across the coffee table. "Then these documents go to the FBI. They detail your involvement from the beginning, including your prior knowledge of the counterfeiting operation, your introduction of Keller to Vanessa, and your role in planning to frame me." Dorothy opened the folder with trembling hands. "These are lies," she whispered, though her eyes betrayed her. "Are they?" Russell raised an eyebrow. "Vanessa has already provided a sworn statement implicating you as the mastermind. It's her word against yours. Who do you think they'll believe? The daughter who fled the country, or the mother who stayed behind to collect the spoils?" It was another lie. Vanessa had signed no such statement, but Dorothy had no way of knowing that. The seed of betrayal Russell had planted earlier bloomed into full certainty in Dorothy's mind. Her own daughter had sacrificed her to save herself. "You're a monster," Dorothy said, but there was no conviction in her voice. "I'm a survivor," Russell corrected. "Something you taught me to be, ironically enough. Now, do we have a deal?" The next day, Dorothy boarded a flight to Amsterdam with a new passport in the name of Elizabeth Reynolds. The lakeside cottage she'd always dreamed of owning would be waiting for her, comfortable but modest, far from the luxury she'd once known. She would never see her daughter again. Meanwhile, Anthony Keller's situation deteriorated rapidly. His attempt to trade information on the Vitali family earned him protective custody, but also a target on his back. 2 guards at the holding facility were on Ricardo Vitali's payroll, and word of Keller's cooperation spread quickly through the criminal underworld. Prosecutors, eager to build a case against the Vitali organization, moved Keller to a secure location to finalize his cooperation agreement. The transport van never arrived at its destination. It was found abandoned on a service road, the 2 U.S. Marshals unconscious from drug coffee, Keller nowhere to be found. 3 days later, Keller's body washed up on the shores of Boston Harbor, bearing the hallmarks of a thorough interrogation before death. The message was clear to anyone else who might consider betraying the Vitali family. Russell received the news with quiet satisfaction. Everything had unfolded according to his design. Keller had been eliminated by the very criminals he'd partnered with. Vanessa and Dorothy were exiled, never to return. The hard acquisition had closed successfully, generating millions in fees for Russell's firm. And Lux Verified, now under his control, was being repositioned as an industry leader in authenticating luxury goods. As Russell sat in his office reviewing the final reports, Philip entered with a concerned expression. "It's over, Russell," he said quietly. "You've won. Completely and utterly." "Yes," Russell agreed, his face betraying no emotion. "Justice has been served." Philip sat across from him. "Has it? Or is this just revenge? Is there a difference?" Russell asked mildly. "I think you know there is," Philip replied. "Justice restores. Revenge destroys. And I'm worried about what this has done to you." Russell considered this. "They try to take everything from me, Philip, my freedom, My reputation, my company. They would have watched me go to prison without a moment's remorse. And now, they've lost everything instead, Philip acknowledged. But at what cost to you? The Russell I knew before this. He was tough, yes, even ruthless in business. But there was a line he wouldn't cross. That Russell died the day his wife pointed at him and said, "He made me do it," Russell replied coldly. "This is who I am now. Someone who ensures his enemies don't get second chances." Philip sighed, recognizing the futility of his concern. "What will you do now?" "Rebuild," Russell said simply. "On my terms, without distractions or vulnerabilities." As Philip left, Russell turned to the window, gazing out at the Boston skyline. He felt neither triumph nor regret, only a cold certainty that he had done what was necessary. The world had shown him its true nature, and he had adapted accordingly. Never again would he allow himself to be vulnerable. Never again would he trust without verification. And never, ever would he forgive those who betrayed him. The Russell Norwood who had believed in second chances was gone. In his place stood a man who had learned the ultimate lesson. Mercy was a luxury reserved for the weak, and he had no intention of ever being weak again. Chapter 9. Ashes to Ashes. 6 months passed. Boston's brutal winter had given way to spring, but Russell Norwood remained cold as ice. His business flourished. The hard acquisition had positioned his firm as a major player in pharmaceutical mergers, attracting new clients eager to benefit from his ruthless efficiency. Lux Verified had been successfully rebranded as the industry's most rigorous authentication service, its connection to the counterfeiting scandal minimized to a footnote about previous management. Russell had sold the colonial home where he had lived with Vanessa, unwilling to remain in a space tainted by betrayal. His new penthouse in a downtown high-rise offered panoramic views of the city and absolute privacy. The interior was minimalist, almost austere. No photographs, no mementos, nothing personal. It was less a home than a fortress. On a warm May evening, Russell sat on his balcony reviewing quarterly projections when his private line rang. Only 5 people had this number, and none called without good reason. "Nor would," he answered. "It's Boyd. We have a situation. Vanessa's back in Boston." Russell's expression didn't change, but his grip on the phone tightened. "Explain." "She flew in yesterday under her Victoria Peters identity. She's staying at the Mandarin Oriental. From what we can gather, she's nearly out of money." "That's impossible," Russell said coldly. "The account I set up had enough to last years if managed properly." Apparently, she wasn't careful. Also, she's not alone. She has a child with her. A boy, approximately 4 months old. Russell closed his eyes briefly, processing this information. "Monitor her movements. No contact. I'll handle this personally." He hung up and walked to his desk, opening a drawer that contained a single file, the complete dossier on Vanessa's new identity. Every detail of her exile had been meticulously planned, including the establishment of an offshore account that would provide a comfortable living in Barcelona. If she had exhausted those funds in just 6 months, she had been catastrophically irresponsible. The child complicated matters. Given the timing, it could only be Keller's. Russell felt no emotional response to this revelation, just another variable to be managed. The next morning, Russell had Boyd book him a suite at the Mandarin Oriental, 2 floors above Vanessa's room. He checked in under a false name and waited for Boyd's team to report on her routine. According to their surveillance, she left the hotel every morning, visiting various financial institutions and law offices, returning frustrated each time. On the 3rd day, Russell decided it was time. He had Boyd call Vanessa's room, impersonating the hotel manager, requesting she come to the main restaurant to discuss an issue with her bill. When she arrived, she would find Russell waiting instead. Vanessa appeared exactly at the arranged time, the baby carrier in her hand. She looked thinner than Russell remembered, her once immaculate appearance now showing signs of strain. The confident socialite had been replaced by a woman clearly struggling to maintain appearances. She froze when she saw him, her face draining of color. "Hello, Vanessa," Russell said calmly, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Please sit down. We have matters to discuss." After a moment's hesitation, She sat, placing the carrier beside her. Inside, the baby slept peacefully, unaware of the tension surrounding him. "You broke our agreement," Russell began without preamble. "The terms were explicit. You were never to return to the United States." "I had no choice," Vanessa replied, her voice low. "The money's gone. The account was emptied 3 months ago." Russell's eyes narrowed slightly. "Impossible. I set up that account myself. No one could access it but you." "Someone did," Vanessa insisted. "I woke up one morning and it was empty. Every penny gone. I tried to contact the bank, but suddenly my documentation wasn't valid anymore. It was like Victoria Peters never existed." Russell studied her carefully, looking for signs of deception. Finding none, he pulled out his phone and sent a text to Diana, instructing her to investigate the account immediately. "Even if what you're saying is true," Russell continued, "returning here violated our agreement. You know the consequences." Vanessa's eyes flashed with a spark of her old defiance. "What are you going to do, Russell? Turn me in? You'd be implicating yourself." "Don't test me, Vanessa. I promise there will be consequences if you returned, and there will be." She leaned forward. "I'm not afraid of you anymore. I've lost everything already. My home, my mother, my identity. The only thing I have left is my son, and I will do anything to protect him." The baby stirred in his carrier, making small whimpering sounds. Vanessa automatically reached to rock him, her maternal instincts momentarily superseding the confrontation. "Keller's child," Russell observed dispassionately. "His name is Michael," Vanessa said, a protective edge at her voice. "And yes, biologically Tony is his father, but Tony never knew about him. I found out I was pregnant after I left the country." Russell's phone vibrated with a message from Diana. "Account emptied 3 months ago. Professional job. Traced to operation in Russia. More details coming." "It seems you're telling the truth about the money," Russell acknowledged. "The question is, what do we do now?" "I need help, Russell," Vanessa admitted, swallowing her pride. "Just enough to start over somewhere. Not Barcelona, obviously. Somewhere I can raise Michael safely." Russell considered her request, weighing variables dispassionately. "And why should I help you? After everything you did? Because despite what you've become, I don't believe you want an innocent child to suffer for his parents' mistakes." The baby was fully awake now, looking around with curious eyes. Russell found himself meeting that innocent gaze, seeing neither Vanessa nor Keller, but simply a child untainted by their crimes. After a long moment, Russell reached a decision. "I'll establish a trust for the child, administered by a third party, accessible only for his education and essential needs. You will receive a modest stipend as his guardian, contingent on you remaining at least 3,000 miles from Boston." "That's it?" Vanessa asked, incredulous. "I'm supposed to live on a modest stipend while raising a child alone?" "You're supposed to be grateful you're not in federal prison," Russell countered coldly. "This arrangement is for the child's benefit, not yours. If you refuse, I'll walk away, and you can explain to the FBI why you're back in the country with fraudulent identification." Vanessa stared at him, searching for any hint of the man she had married. Finding none, she nodded slowly. "You really meant it, didn't you? What you said that day at the safe house. You'll never forgive me." "Forgiveness implies I still care enough to resent you," Russell replied. "I don't. You're simply a loose end that needs tying up." As they finalized the details of the arrangement, Russell maintained his detached demeanor. The trust would be established immediately, with the first payments available within 48 hours. Enough time for Vanessa to be on a plane far away from Boston. When everything was settled, Vanessa gathered her things to leave, then paused. "You know what the saddest part is, Russell? I really did love you once. Before Tony, before all of it. I wish you could believe that." Russell met her gaze with empty eyes. "What you believe you felt is irrelevant. Actions define truth, not sentiments. Your actions spoke clearly." Vanessa nodded sadly. "So do yours." She lifted the baby carrier. "Goodbye, Russell. I hope someday you find whatever it is you're looking for." "I'm not looking for anything," he replied. "I've already found what matters, absolute self-reliance." After she left, Russell remained at the table, gazing out at the Boston skyline. He felt no triumph. No closure, no satisfaction. Just the quiet certainty that another potential threat had been neutralized. That evening, Russell sat alone in his penthouse, reviewing the final details of Vanessa's departure. She would be on a flight to Seattle the next morning, with connections to the trust already established. The child would be provided for, and Vanessa would be kept on a tight enough leash to ensure her compliance. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Few people knew his address, and none would visit unannounced. Cautiously, he checked the security camera to find Philip standing in the hallway. "This is unexpected," Russell said as he opened the door. Philip entered, glancing around at the Spartan interior. "Nice place. Very efficient." "Why are you here, Philip?" The attorney set his briefcase on the counter. "Boyd told me about Vanessa. I wanted to make sure you were handling it appropriately." "The situation is resolved," Russell replied flatly. "She'll be gone by morning." Philip studied his client, concern evident in his expression. When this all started, I understood your anger. The betrayal, the setup, anyone would want revenge. But it's been 6 months, Russell. You've won. Completely. Yet you're still. Still what? Russell challenged. Still at war. Philip finished. Except there's no one left to fight. Russell turned away. "I'm not interested in amateur psychology. Philip, it's not psychology, it's concern. I've known you for 15 years. The man standing in front of me now is just a shell of who you were." "The man I was weak," Russell said dismissively. He trusted blindly. He believed in loyalty and love. "Look where that got him." "It got him a life," Philip countered. He gestured around the empty apartment. "This isn't living, Russell. It's surviving." "Surviving is underrated," Russell replied coldly. "It means you haven't been defeated." Philip sighed, recognizing the futility of his concern. "The papers for Vanessa's trust are in my briefcase. I'll need your signature." As Russell signed the documents, Philip made one last attempt. "That child, Michael, he's innocent in all this. Maybe someday." "He's Keller's son," Russell interrupted. "Nothing more, nothing less. I've ensured he'll be provided for. My obligation ends there." After Philip left, Russell stood on his balcony, watching night settle over Boston. In 6 short months, he had systematically dismantled one life and constructed another. His business was thriving. His enemies were destroyed or exiled. He had emerged victorious from a war few even knew had been fought. Yet standing in his fortress high above the city, Russell Norwood felt neither triumph nor peace. The man who had once believed in connection, in trust, in the possibility of happiness had been burned away, leaving only ashes where his heart had been. And in those ashes, a new truth had crystallized, a truth as cold and hard as diamond. In this world, you could have power or vulnerability, strength or sentiment, control or connection, but never both. Russell had made his choice, and he would never look back. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen, and I'll see you there.